It's so great to see you this morning. We wish you a good morning. We're thankful so much for your presence. We're especially grateful to our great God, how good He is, and how good He is to us. So thank you for your presence here today in worship. I would ask for you to be back tonight, especially as we have moved into a discussion about how this culture, one of the things that's defining it right now, is how much it and we collectively struggle with what might get classified as mental health or emotional difficulties. And so tonight we're going to look at some of those things through the lens of Scripture. We're starting with Scripture on purpose, and we'll talk from the book of Lamentations again for a second week, and we'll especially emphasize hope and what hope is and just how connected to truth hope indeed is. And so be sure that you're back tonight at 5 as we discuss that helpful topic. It's always been a need for God's people, and it especially is helpful for us in this day and this time. So tonight at 5, we'll discuss hope through the lens of the book of Lamentations. This morning, we're going to start with one text, one verse from 2 Samuel chapter 4. We'll then read through 2 Samuel chapter 9. So if you want to mark both of those passages, we'll get to them in just a moment. 2 Samuel chapter 4, we'll look at verse 4, one verse, and then dive into 2 Samuel chapter 9. A few years ago, there was a lady by the name of Elsie Holdren, who was a security guard at this the Moore Justice Center in Florida. She'd been there over 4 years, and then she was reassigned. It was pretty clear it was kind of a demotion. The supervisor wasn't happy with her, and here's what the note her supervisor wrote. Here's the note she wrote to her when she reassigned her. Due to your caring and giving nature, you are compromising your position as a security officer by trying to be everyone's friend. This is not a job requirement, nor is it what you are paid to do. She was demoted, reassigned, because she was being too kind, too nice. So the supervisor received dozens of letters from attorneys and judges and workers in that courthouse. And then there was a petition sent to the supervisor with 155 signatures on that petition. One of the attorneys that worked out of that courthouse even went on the record saying this: I believe I speak for our entire courthouse community when I say that Holdren, she is the best, most security-minded guard you have, and that the stated reasons for this transfer are appalling. Why would you demote someone for being so kind? There are certain settings, certain positions and roles in which kindness feels radical and unusual. We could add to the list an ancient king. An ancient king might be known for any number of things: talents, skills, physical might, military prowess. But typically, ancient kings were not known for exercising kindness, and especially not known for exercising kindness toward their enemies and their enemies' families. This morning, as we continue studying the quality of the fruit of the Spirit, kindness, that list is, of course, found in Galatians 5, verses 22 and 23. We're reminded that our kindness happens, and is to happen, because of our relationship primarily to God. It's knowing that we come from God and that God blesses us and that we're saved by God, that we then show kindness not just to others generally, but to all others in any and every circumstance. Our scripture reading for the morning, Proverbs 14, verse 31. Whoever a poor man insults his maker, not just the poor person, but the one who made the poor person. But he who is generous to the needy honors him, honors God by being generous to the poor. A few chapters over, Proverbs 19 and verse 17. Whoever is generous to the poor lends to the Lord, and the Lord will be the one who repays him for his deed. And so, yes, there's a basic level at which our kindness is horizontal to one another, but our kindness to one another is also a reflection of our understanding of God's kindness toward us, and how every soul is a soul made in the image of God, and every soul is worth the dignity of being shown kindness, and specifically the kindness of God. We're going to study a moment in the life of David when David shows kindness, and specifically shows kindness that is rooted in his relationship to God. He's going to be lavish and radical to a member of the previous royal family. And he's going to do so in such a way that outside of God, it would be unthinkable that someone would do it. We start there in 2 Samuel chapter 4, one single verse number 4. Jonathan, the son of Saul, had a son who was crippled in his feet. Here's how he became crippled in his feet. He was 5 years old when the news about Saul and Jonathan came from Jezreel. That news was they were both killed in battle. And this son of Jonathan, the grandson of Saul, was 5 years old when that happened. And his nurse took him up and fled. Now, why was she doing that? It was because the king and the king's son had just been slain, and now any member of the royal family is at risk. Not only at risk from enemies, but also at risk from those around them, even of their own nation. If we want to try to seize the throne, if we want to take back more power, now's the time to pounce on their relatives. So the nurse picks him up to take him to flee. And then as she fled in her haste, their sense of panic, he fell. Either he fell out of her arms or she fell with him. Somehow he fell and became lame. His name was Mephibosheth. So think about what's happened. God has promised Saul, your kingdom is not going to continue, or your reign over the kingdom is not going to continue. The lineage for my kingdom and its king will not be from the tribe of Benjamin. It'll be from the tribe of Judah. It'll not be from your lineage of Saul. It'll be from the house of Jesse, the house of David. And that transition begins on the day that Saul died in battle. And in that same moment of time, the grandson of Saul, the son of Jonathan, is injured to the degree to where he is crippled in his feet. So now you're stacking tragedy upon tragedy. The sign of the rejection of Saul seen in his death, but now Mephibosheth's feet have become a reminder of Saul's sin. Saul first rejects God, therefore God rejects him as king. And now he has this crippled condition reflecting what a terrible state things have fallen into because of sin. That's also seen in his name. We're told here, 2 Samuel 4, his name is Mephibosheth. That's the name you see attributed to him in the Samuel record. But over in 2 Chronicles chapter 8, you'll see that he was given another name, Merib-Baal, meaning that he contended against Baal. That was his name given by Jonathan, that he is going to stand up against the false gods. He was one who stood up for the true God and against false gods. But Mephibosheth, this different name, actually means something else. It means from the mouth of shame, or one who scatters shame. His crippled condition now reflects the shame that's happened because of Saul's sin. Now think for a moment how he's this walking symbol of the consequences of sin. And every day he has to depend on others, and every day he's limited physically. Just knowing kind of some of the things that we've all had to deal with in our own lives, and how emotionally a chronic condition or a physical condition that doesn't go away, how emotionally that wears us down. How often do you think Mephibosheth would have thought things like this? Why couldn't I have just died the same day they did? Why have I been struck with this terrible condition? Why am I the one that's had to survive, but yet survive with something that's so debilitating? Why do I have to depend on others? I was once a part of the royal family, but now I'm crippled and identified by a name of shame. All right, so let's kind of just remember Mephibosheth, how he became lame and crippled, and let's now turn over to 2 Samuel chapter 9 as we see this story from the life of David. 2 Samuel chapter 9, beginning verse 1. David said, "Is there still anyone left in the house of Saul, that I may show him kindness for Jonathan's sake?" Now there was a servant of the house of Saul whose name was Ziba, And they called him to David, and the king said to him, "Are you Ziba?" And he said, "I am your servant." And the king said, "Is there not still someone of the house of Saul, that I may show the kindness of God to him?" Ziba said to the king, "There is still a son of Jonathan. He is crippled in his feet." The king said to him, "Well, where is he?" And Ziba said to the king, "He is in the house of Machir, the son of Ammiel, at Lo-debar." Then King David sent and brought him from the house of Machir, the son of Ammiel, at Lo-debar. So all we know right now is that David is put out this word, I need to show kindness. Is there anyone? And he receives word from someone who has a connection to Saul's house. Hey, there is this one young man, he's Saul's grandson, and he's crippled. And David doesn't ask any more questions other than, where is he? Bring him here. Okay? Now, when he finds out where he's at, you see it repeated twice in verses 4 and 5. He's dependent upon others. He's living in the estate of someone else, likely a wealthy person in the area, outside of the mainstream area of Israel, but specifically at Lo-debar, which means no pasture land. It was a place of barrenness, a place that would have been described as a lifeless place. So here he was, again, born in the palace, in a royal family, certainly not lacking for provisions, and now he's crippled, and he's living in a place out of the wilderness called Lo-debar. Now, interestingly, before verse 6, we've read through verse 5, we've still not yet read his name in chapter 9. We know, just kind of by summary already, where we're going with this. But you can see there's a little bit of apprehension and a little bit of suspense until verse 6, because we might be asking, is this the same son of Jonathan that we heard about several chapters ago? David doesn't appear to be aware of him at all. And so now he's being told he exists. And then now, verse number 6 is going to tell us the interaction that happens when Mephibosheth is brought to David. Verse 6. Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, son of Saul, came to David and fell on his face and paid homage. And David said, "Mephibosheth." And he answered, "Behold, I'm your servant." Now pause for a minute. Just think about what Mephibosheth might be thinking. Here he is, one of the last remnants of the royal family of before, and he's crippled. He's been living in a place that's barren. And now the king has found him, and he's brought before the king. When he bows down, is it possible he's even thinking, am I about to be beheaded? Am I about to be executed before the king because I'm a part of the royal family? That would have been the expectation of many before any king of the ancient world. But now listen to David in verse 7. David said to him, "Do not fear." Do not fear. He could sense he was afraid. So David says, "Do not fear." Why? "For I will show you kindness for the sake of your father Jonathan, and I will restore to you all the land of Saul your father, and you shall eat at my table always." And he paid homage and said, "What is your servant that you should show regard for a dead dog such as I?" A couple of observations from those two verses. Notice David's order. Do not fear, I will show you kindness. Remember we mentioned this last week, that kindness is connected to anxiety or to fear. And when God says don't be anxious, do not fear, he follows it up by saying, look how kind and generous I am to you. We live in a world that's afraid. Our kindness is a godly response to an age of anxiety, an age of worry, an age of fear. And David eases his anxieties by saying, I will show you kindness. Then he does two things. Verse 7, I will restore to you all the land of Saul. You don't have to live on the edges. You don't have to live outside of town. You don't have to be a hermit. You don't have to hide. You can now live in public. You can now once again have your family's estate. Restore the land to him. It would have been outside of Jerusalem, but much, much closer to Jerusalem than he had been. And then he says this, and you shall eat at my table always. You've got a spot at my table. So he says, you're accepted. You've been rejected. You've been on the run. You've been in hiding. You're fearful because of a change in power to a new king, but now you must know you have a place at my table always. Verse 8 is important because it shows us just how this was received. This wasn't some manipulative ploy by David to keep his enemies closer. Mephibosheth says, what in the world? What is it that I, just a mere slave, would receive this? And then he says that you would show kindness to such a dead dog as I. That was a pretty low insult to call someone a dead dog, and now he's calling himself one. I'm a mere slave. I'm a dead dog. Dogs were seen as lowly creatures, insulting to call someone that. And he says, I'm a dead dog. I'm useless before you. So when we see Mephibosheth's response, we see this is an act of kindness in and of itself. To give him his land back, the family's land back, and to welcome him to his table always. Now keep reading. We see how that table thing comes to the surface even more. Verse 9. The king called Ziba, Saul's servant, and said to him, all that belonged to Saul and to all his house I have given to your master's grandson. I've restored the estate, the property. Verse 10. And you and your sons and your servants shall till the land for him, shall bring in the produce, that your master's grandson may have bread to eat. But Mephibosheth, your master's grandson, shall always eat at my table. It's likely what's happening here is there are public times when the kingly family is going to all get together and eat. When they're welcoming someone from someone else, or when it's a celebration, a feast. And David is saying, anytime the royal family's together, Mephibosheth is to be here with me. Likely other times, what we might call private meal times, Mephibosheth's probably just going to live off the land that he's living on. And so he assigns Ziba to work the land for Mephibosheth so that he is taken care of. Here's why that becomes important. Now, Ziba had 15 sons and 20 servants. Ziba had 35 men he could set to work on this estate for Mephibosheth. I knew that was going to happen at least once today. Because he couldn't work it himself. He's crippled, and now he has the land and a way to work the land. Verse 11, then Ziba said to the king, according to all that my lord the king commands his servant, so will your servant do. So listen to the summary here, verse 11. So Mephibosheth ate at David's table like one of the king's sons. And Mephibosheth had a young son whose name was Micah. And all who lived in Ziba's house became Mephibosheth's servants. So Mephibosheth lived in Israel, for he ate always at the king's table. Now he was lame in both his feet. So you see a beautiful restoration, a restoring of the land, a restoring of the place at the king's table, and even the use of one of the servants of Saul to now serve the needs of Mephibosheth. As we look at this story and see how it is clearly an act of kindness, let's look at two key takeaways for us this morning to help us to be more kind like God is kind. Number one, have the attitude that says, I'm going to seek to show kindness. I'm going to actively look for opportunities to show kindness. That's exactly what David did. He begins by saying, is there anyone still left out there that I might show kindness? He knew the grim reality that Saul's other sons had died, that Saul and Jonathan had died. Are there any heirs left? But he still seeks to show kindness. Is there anybody? He doesn't begin with any parameters or limitations other than that they be from the house of Saul. And then he's going to use this word 3 times. Verses 1, verse 3, verse 7. Verse 7, of course, is the one to Mephibosheth himself. And it's the closest kind of approximation. We have the New Testament word for love, agape. In the Old Testament, you have a Hebrew word called chesed. It's kind of the closest to it. And he uses it 3 times. And it's a combination of several principles. It maybe is the sacrificial side of what we call love. It's faithfulness and then it's ongoing and enduring, but it's also actively kind. And so all 3 times it's used here, it's translated kindness because you see it as an active showing of generosity. In this instance to Mephibosheth. It's used of God, and now David is saying, I need to use it toward others. And he just starts out with this attitude of saying, I need to seek someone to be kind toward. So David was actively living out the very quality that describes God's treatment of David, but also of each of us. I hope we understand. that there is a massive gap of difference between seeking to show kindness and seeking to receive kindness. That if we go about looking for others to give us kindness, we'll always come up empty. We'll rarely find what we're looking for. But seeking to show kindness is the attitude of God. There's a difference between seeking to show kindness and I'll be kind when it's easy, I'll be kind when it's possible, I'll be kind when I have the ability to. David was saying, I need to be kind. I'm going to be kind. I will find a way to be kind. Always looking to be kind. And that's because David's motives were tied to his relationships to parties beyond, in this instance, Mephibosheth. See, his kindness was rooted in his relationship to Jonathan and his relationship to Saul, and more than that, his relationship to God. Consider how easy it would have been for David to have let his desire to be kind, let it die when Saul and Jonathan died. Who's going to know? Who's going to know if he's kind or not kind? But David's burden was tied to something greater than the act itself. Therefore, he had the power, the ability, the fortitude to follow through and to be kind. While we seek to show kindness for the benefit of others, that desire is rooted in what we have from God, and knowing He has been so kind to us. We know who He is. He's been kind to us, and so now we're kind to anyone in every situation. When that happens, it will stand out. It will be odd. We'll be like the security guard who was demoted because she was kind. And you see just how this was odd just by the limited parties involved in the story. Ziba throws in that detail. Hey, yeah, there's a grandson, but remember, he's crippled. He's not a threat. He might make you look bad if you bring him in. And then Mephibosheth himself has to question it a little bit. What are you saying? Why would I be worth this? It was unusual. It was odd for David to have this power and this prestige and to show such kindness. When we're kind because of God, when we're seeking to show kindness, it will inevitably stand out and be different. Because it's not circumstantial, it's instead rooted in our relationship to Him. Couldn't help but think this week of Matthew 25. Remember there, it's Jesus talks of the difference between the goats and the sheep at judgment. And it's the sheep, He says, who showed kindness to the least of these. That's exactly what David does here in this text. Is the one who could not repay. The one who could not do anything that David could do. The one who was really not all that valuable to David's kingdom and David's vision for the kingdom. Yet David is supremely kind to him. And I think about that setup that Jesus tells in that parable about Judgment Day, the goats and the sheep. And you think how interesting it is that both parties were surprised. The sheep were surprised because we don't remember being kind to you, Jesus. But Jesus says when you were kind to the least of these, you were kind to me. You saw me in them despite how difficult it was to help them. You saw me in them despite how needy they were. But because they were regularly kind, because they went about with the attitude of always seeking to show kindness, it caught them off guard. Oh, you mean we help you? We don't really remember that, but okay. But the others are surprised too. And you can just envision this because Jesus says you were not kind to me. You have to believe they're saying, well, I was kind. Here's all the people that I was kind to, but we don't remember seeing you and not being kind to you. And Jesus says, yeah, but there were other people that you were not kind to. You saw the least of these, the hardest to serve, and you didn't serve them. So when David says he's going to seek to show kindness, and he's told, hey, remember this boy's crippled, it doesn't change David's mind whatsoever. Because he was seeking to show kindness, he was actively kind to anyone in any situation that came before him. But then our second observation for the morning is that true kindness comes from our deep security in God. We referenced that last week some with Jesus teaching from Matthew 11 and how that was rooted in his relationship with the Father, and then he gives that to us. My yoke is easy, it's kind. But this is especially true for David here. This is continuing a trajectory David has long established by the time he becomes king. It's when Saul is tracking him down twice. Saul will go fight battles, he'll come try to kill David. He'll go fight battles, try to kill David. And twice, David has the opportunity to kill Saul. And if he does that, he immediately becomes the most beloved man in the kingdom. Fair and square, he killed him, he's the new king. But both times, he spares Saul's life because he knows the Lord is the one who anointed and appointed Saul as king. One of those occasions is when Saul recognizes David's mercy and recognizes God's blessing on David, and he cries out to David, asking him to agree to this covenant to protect his family, to not destroy his family. So David's keeping his word. He's secure in God, he keeps his word. On another occasion, Jonathan, knowing that the promise has been made to David about David to be the king, Jonathan's not going to be the king. Jonathan does the same. Will you protect my family? So a transition of power is one of the most insecure moments in leaders' lives. When parties change hands in our country, or when families change hands, as in this occasion, kingdom after kingdom after kingdom, nation after nation throughout history. It's a highly insecure and volatile moment. And the most common way for new kings to take care of it was just to eliminate all the family members of the previous regime. So Jonathan and Saul were asking David for mercy when he becomes king. And so now he is. Because he's not insecure, he is indeed secure before God. God has kept his word completely to David by allowing him to become king, and now David is going to keep his covenant to God. It's an interesting part of the text because it's building. You get to, so you start in chapter 5 and you build all the way into chapter 9 where we're at. You're going into chapter 10 even, and this is the apex of David's reign. Chapter 11 is the Bathsheba incident. So it's building and it's at its peak before he makes those sinful decisions. So he's going to restore things religiously before God, bring the ark back. He's going to defeat the Philistines, kind of keeps them at bay once and for all. They're never the same enemy they were before David against the Israelites. They're having economic success. And one of the verses right before chapter 9 begins, the very end of chapter 8, is 8 verse 15. So David ruled or reigned over all Israel, and David administered justice and equity to all his people. After showing all these things that David has done great as king, you get this summary. He's reigning over a united kingdom, and he's administering two things, justice and equity, to all his people. Do we see how this text of 2 Samuel 9 validates that last phrase, all his people? Since you can look at Mephibosheth and see how he was the least of these, the one who, by any other king's standards, would be worthy of the least attention, David shows him supreme kindness in the likeness of God. Now David is proving himself to be one who gives out justice, and he gives out equity, or the idea is faithfulness in the eyes of the people. He's acting in the best interest of the people, and he's doing it for all. So what we find here is that just as 1 Samuel 17, when David defeats Goliath, just as that proves that God was correct in choosing David to be the next king behind Saul, now this text of 2 Samuel 9 is showing us just the type of king David is. He is a king, use the words from Acts 13, after the likeness of God's own heart. He will do God's will. For a crippled man from an enemy family, Saul, who tried to kill him on multiple occasions, previous regime, for him to show this supreme kindness shows that he truly is kind and caring toward all the people. He would say in Psalm 15, talking about the kind of guy that's going to reign on the holy hill, the kind of guy who's going to be the king. Who shall sojourn in your tent? Who shall dwell in your holy hill? He who walks blamelessly, does what is right, and speaks truth in his heart, who does not slander with his tongue and does no evil to his neighbor, or takes up a reproach against his friend. David would talk there in Psalm 15 about the type of king that God deserves. And now you see in chapter 9, he's living out that kindness before others. But then also you see that supreme kindness in the fact that he provides Ziba to take care of Mephibosheth's needs. And the fact that Ziba is still around is proof of David's patience and kindness. Here's a servant from the previous regime, And now he's still in the palace, and he's still able to help. And that furthers the atmosphere and the culture of kindness that David was trying to establish. What David did was unheard of among any royal family of that day or any day, to elevate and to honor this member of a previous regime. David proves what we talked about last week, that while kindness is sacrificial and it's costly, it's not risky, because he trusts God completely and fully. So we will seek to show kindness because we understand just how kind God is to us. The Christian knows he or she has received far more kindness than we could ever repay back to God. So whatever our kindness cost us is less than what we've received from God. And it's more than worth it for us to show them his love. As we close this morning, it's important we see another connection with this story. That just as we should imitate David's kindness, we need to ultimately see ourselves as receiving the kindness of God, just as Mephibosheth received it from David. We are all Mephibosheths, and that we have been crippled by our sin, our choices to go against God. And yet, when we are in Christ, we are invited and welcomed by a king who is lavish and longs to bless us. He is abundant in his grace toward us. We cannot ever begin to earn or to buy back the standing that he gives us. Think of how emotional Mephibosheth would have been every time he came to the banquet table. All the other sons of David are there, and he's welcomed just the same as they. They would have walked in with much pomp and circumstance. They were like David, and they had these strong presences about them. And here he is, best case, limps in. Maybe he comes in with crutches that make loud noise. Worst case, he has to be brought in and carried in by someone else. You can see how the potential for embarrassment would have been huge, but he's got a spot at the table. And how neat and interesting it is that every time he is sat at the table, he's sitting in a seat that previously would have been his. If it was not for his grandfather's sin and rebellion, if it was not for that fateful day when he was dropped and maimed, and he gets to sit once again at the banquet table because of the kindness of the king. He was born in the palace setting, but he became disfigured. He was left to hide out in a land of barrenness, but now he's welcomed and celebrated at the king's table because of the king's love. Now, once you're there at the table, picture yourself being another member of the party at the table. And you look and you see son after son after son, and you see Mephibosheth is just the same as they. He's not treated any differently. And once you're at the table, you also would not be able to see the fact that he is lame in both feet. That once they're at the table, they're all welcomed. They're all welcomed the same as the king's special sons. So author Charles Swindoll said, the tablecloth of grace covered his crippled feet. No difference once you're welcomed by the loving, kind king. But God, being rich in mercy, because of the great love with which he loved us, even when we were dead in our trespasses, not just crippled, but dead in our sin, he made us alive and then made us alive together with Christ. By grace you have been saved, and he raised us up with him and seated us with him in the heavenly places in Christ Jesus, so that in the coming ages, any day forward, any era forward, any culture forward, from time beginning, verse 7, in the coming ages he might show the immeasurable riches of his grace in kindness toward us in Christ Jesus. When we look to God, we see a God who is abundant in his riches. And we see that, evidence of that, in his kindness toward us, to invite us to his table, to welcome us to his table, to show us we do not have to hide in our shame, and to show us that we are accepted before him through his son, Jesus Christ. If you've not made the decision to obey Jesus Christ, You've heard about His kindness and His love, but you've not obeyed it. Please change that today. Please choose today as the day you submit to Christ. Choose to believe in Him as the Son of God. Choose to confess that belief. Choose to turn your life around from sin. Live the new life of repentance. Choose to be immersed in water, where He forgives, where He saves. The moment where He adds you to His body, the church. The moment He raises you, the moment He seats you with Christ. Choose today to come to Him. If you've been living outside of that grace and kindness, don't let that continue. It's not worth it. Please come back to Him today if you need to do that. Please know that we're here for you. Would you come now as we sing?